South of downtown Portland, Oregon, where Arthur Street turns into Kelly Avenue, there is something that is a bit of a novelty these days. An underground tunnel built with the original intention of transporting pedestrians on foot from one side of a busy street to the other. Nowadays, this passageway is best known for the massive homeless encampments that have been set up in there from time to time, the focal subject of videos taken by people who have taken the chance in going down there and seeing how things look for themselves. With the spread of videos from this tunnel, they have erroneously been used as a metaphor for what Portland looks like as a whole. I've passed here a few times, once taking a glance inside for a video I did a couple years ago, catching it during one of its better states of cleanliness. One might look at the idea of a dinosaur of pedestrian protection like this and think the notion of such a place being dark, dirty, and unsafe to be more of a contemporary issue, something that's only popped up in the last 30-40 years. But you might be surprised about the reality of places like these. A few years back, I started a series on sketchy places, starting with a video about a Burger King that once stood on Burnside in downtown Portland that, despite being a Burger King and being gone for many years, it's a place that so many remember. This series has since shifted to primarily covering hotel and motel history, and I really wanted something different for the next time around. And I think I found it. This tunnel at the start of Kelly Avenue exists in an area where there's actually 3 tunnels, such as this, that were constructed at the same time with the same purpose. Just south of this location is the old Josiah Failing School, now the National University of Natural Medicine, which, in particular with expansion work on Harbor Drive in 1947, found itself isolated in a heavily trafficked area. This same year, local newspapers started calling this area Death Island, with a major push started to provide safe passage for the children that were going to Failing. This would result in 4 different passages being erected, including the overpass just west of the school passing over modern-day Nadeau Parkway, formerly a stretch of Harbor Drive. In this photograph from 1947, we can see an overview of this area as the Harbor Drive work was going on. We can see at this time that the Kelly Avenue underpass is not yet there, as it would not be completed until 1948. But beyond there, to the south, we can see the construction of Grover Street, wrapping under an in-construction Harbor Drive overpass. And just above that, we can see a small space along the earth wall, which is where another pedestrian tunnel was built. This tunnel also still exists, wrapping around under the Nadeau Parkway. Another tunnel that people tend to avoid because of what can be found in there. This one serves as one of few ways to get from one side of the parkway to another in this part of town. I've been through this tunnel several times. The first time back in 2019, as I passed through there several times because I couldn't seem to figure out where I was going. Even with my pass-throughs, where we can see it wasn't too bad in there, one can understand why a given pedestrian might not be excited about rolling through this particular tunnel. Like many places, this tunnel is often filled with graffiti, something that's hardly a new thing. Even in this article from 1981, where graffiti around the city was called a nuisance, there was a picture depicting this tunnel at that time. In another article from 1987, this same tunnel was photographed again. Just goes to show, graffiti around Portland is not just a 21st century thing. This tunnel, the Kelly Avenue Tunnel, and the overpass constructed were all built to the benefit of the failing school kids. But something I never knew was there was another one of these tunnels erected to get people past an off-ramp from then Harbor Drive to access the Ross Island Bridge. I never would have even thought to look for this had I not seen this 1948 map, wherein we can see one of these tunnels marked. I also saw references to a Woods Street tunnel being built, which may have been in reference to this particular one as it was built in between Grover and Woods Streets. And even in this 1947 overview of the Harbor Drive construction, we can see the tunnel portion at this site has been built in place, just awaiting the off-ramp to be built over it. This tunnel can also still be found, granted not exactly on an advisable sidewalk, but it's there. Tunnel could have looked worse. Yeah, you can really tell that all this stuff was built at the same time though, 1947, 1948, because in 1947 they were building this overpass right here, and around that time the Kelly Avenue subway was put in among others, and they all have this same railing to it. There was others around the same time that were also like this. And initially, before knowing the history, I never would have guessed that this was also, but I don't know. It just didn't seem to me that it was built that long ago, but you know, I find myself getting educated from time to time. In fact, quite frequently. But there was 3, tunnels made, and this is the one overpass that was made because you didn't want kids from the failing school here having to dodge traffic through. Could you imagine kids, even with a crosswalk, which weren't even that really in vogue in the late 40s, trying to race across this traffic? And a lot of the residences are on this side. You know, you look back this way, there's a few homes still peppered in here. A lot of them were removed, but the river's not that far down, so a lot of the kids were probably living on this side of Harbor, so it was really important to get them, give them safe passage over to this side. So it wouldn't surprise me if this route was used considerably more often than the alternatives. Kelly Avenue one is right down this little ramp that goes down behind Harbor, and then the Grover, and I'm just calling it the Wood Street one, are actually the Wood Street one's right up there. So I guess if you were a kid that lived further that direction, maybe you'd use that, but I feel like the average kid would probably go this way to get safely to the other side of Harbor Drive. Now on Porter, and I see I'm just the other side of the old failing school, which, I mean, the fact that they put so much effort into getting all of these, presumably safe ways for kids to get to where they needed to go, it does make sense. This school was the first school was built here in the early 1880s. This one was built, I want to say 1912, 1913. This replacement school was built. And failing school was always like a major school in terms of like how many kids were going here and whatnot. So it made sense that they were like, okay, this school is surrounded by traffic. There wasn't really any kind of simple, steady way to get kids to the other side of Harbor Drive. So it made sense at the time that they went to this length, even though by the late 40s, things like these underpasses were out of style. This is not the greatest way to walk. Yeah, I don't even know if this is accessible. And if it was, I don't know if I'd want to go down it. Oh yeah, it looks like they have it fenced off, which is probably a good idea. This has to be recent. The most up-to-date Google Maps imagery had this still open. Like at one point there was like caution tape over it. But yeah, I figured, I was kind of surprised to see that this was still open, and anyway, it doesn't mean there's not somebody staying down in here. Yeah. Oh God, the ground, it's so low in there. Can I zoom down in there? Look at how low the ceiling is. They fix the situation the best way they know how. We have a crosswalk. Trees start popping up here. I don't know if I'm going to get much of a look over here. Yeah. Because it's... just keep going down. That's what happens. The railing, you go down. So from this angle, you can't even see where you enter because it's like the top of the ceiling is right there. So it's obstructed by this brush, but you go down the stairs and go in that way, cross under that little off-ramp. This off-ramp leads you off of what was, now Nato Parkway was Harbor Drive. It wraps you around, dips you down over there, and you can cross Ross Island Bridge to the east side of the river. So there's the one. I'm just calling it the Wood Street one. And then literally right here is how you get down to the Grover Tunnel. I mean, it mostly just smells musty in here, which could smell worse. And just, I think the added, I'm sure the lighting is better at night, but the fact that the lighting is so, like, dim during the day, it's so dark in here, like, we look like we're going into the light of heaven, but it's really just outside again. another tunnel I never would have guessed. I mean, I don't know. I don't have a lot of experience with tunnels. I don't know why I'm acting like I should be an authority. I've known these are here for a while. I figured the Kelly Avenue one had been here for a long time. But I didn't really think this one had been here that long. But it turns out they were all built at the same time, and I was kind of having a hard time. And I've seen a lot of erroneous dates given for when these were built. And I actually found in literally one newspaper article, and then, was able to verify it further down the road with like other articles, diagrams, things like that. They literally referenced the Grover Street Tunnel being in the works, and then the Woods Street Tunnel, which I can only assume was the name given to that other one. It's right over there. And then the Kelly Avenue one, they reference in the same article as probably being ready in a couple of weeks, and that was in a 1948 article. So these were all built at the same time because they all had the same purpose. They were here to help the kids at the elementary school. And from this view, you can actually see pretty much three of these, because you've got the school and you can actually see the overpass right there. And you back up, and right over there's the railing around the entrance to the other one. And then of course it's obstructed where I'm at, but right around the corner here, the trail continues on down. And there's that Grover Street one. These 4 pedestrian routes were completed in 1948, again as a way of protecting school children. And the tunnels are some of the only ones still existing in the city, despite the minimal purpose they serve. Even in the case of the Kelly Avenue tunnel, with new crosswalks put in close by, there was a push to close this tunnel down in the late 2000s, which would later be dropped after blowback from some locals who wanted to keep it around. Even by the late 40s, these types of pedestrian underpasses were hardly a new thing. And I've been repeatedly using the term tunnels to describe these places, which works in a modern day sense and overall, but they were actually known by a different name in decades past: pedestrian subways. While we tend to think of underground tunnels used by passenger trains when we think of a subway, a simple definition of the word is an underground way. This can include a passageway under a street for use by pedestrians. And the Failing School was not the first school in the Portland area to have such subways constructed with the objective of protecting children. Pedestrian subways date back into the 1800s and were often associated with busy railway lines as a way of keeping people from having to cross the tracks. But with the explosion of the automobile really taking off in the 1920s, a new concern was established. Now pedestrians needed to be protected from cars on the street. It was later in this decade that the pedestrian subway started becoming a thing in Portland, as much as it ever would. A major focus of them early on was to connect passengers to streetcar lines via safety islands when the streetcars traveled down the middle of the street. But as far back as September 1925, a plan was suggested to construct a pedestrian subway under Interstate Avenue at its intersection with Ainsworth Street in North Portland. This was suggested in the aftermath of the recently constructed Ockley Green School, near that intersection. Many kids in the area lived on the opposite side of Interstate Avenue. While formerly the lesser-used Patton Street, this route would be linked with Maryland Street to the south to become Interstate Avenue. North of there, up in the Kenton area, this avenue would merge with Denver Avenue and run north to cross the Interstate Bridge, completed in 1917, which crossed the Columbia River into Washington. This all had turned Interstate into a primary north-south route on the east side of the Willamette River, making it a potentially dangerous avenue for all those school children to cross over. And so, this subway was constructed going under Interstate Avenue. This is the image that sparked my interest in this subject as a whole. I hadn't given these things much thought in the past, but when I saw this image, I started wondering where some of these were elsewhere in town. I never really thought it would go that far beyond just showing some locations where these subways once were, but there's a history there. This particular subway was thought to only be the beginning, with it suggested some 30 more of these should be built for other schools in the city. So the school is right over here, as you can see, lining up, because the tunnel wasn't perfectly, you can see in the picture that the entrance was a little bit north of the exit, and the exit was very much kind of in line with the sidewalk, so it would have been like here. So it probably would have ended kind of close to in line with this. So the entrance, give or take, would have been, right about here, and the kids would go down there, slightly angle over, and that's how they got to the other side of Interstate Avenue. But while the construction of this subway was initially met with positivity and set the stage for others to be built in the near future, it would not be long before the same issues that permeated the entire history of these types of passageways in the city of Portland would take off. By the fall of 1927, the city's school board denounced this subway as a dark and dirty place that served as a hideout for degenerates. This is horrifying when we consider the fact that this tunnel was built primarily to be used by children. As would be commonplace for other subways, the city tried to downplay the condition of this one, even going so far as to say that removing this subway would not stop degenerates from hanging around schools. Just deflection. A creep is more likely to attack in a dark, secluded place than up above in broad daylight, where the potential of being seen is drastically higher. Perhaps the rapidly declining reputation of the subway by Ockley Green is why there weren't dozens more of them built in the immediate future. I only found one effort made during this time to have another one built, that being in 1927 when the city council pushed to build a subway under Sandy Boulevard near 54th Avenue to safely transport Rose City Park school children. Despite this drama taking off in 1927, just a couple years later, 1933, it was reported that the interstate subway needed cleaning and better lighting. It was also suggested that a gate or a door be put in at the subway entrances to be locked outside of school hours. Probably would have been a good idea. I first saw this picture from 1929 reposted on the Forgotten Oregon Facebook page, which included a lot of comments from those who lived in the area and or attended Ockley Green many decades ago. One poster said they recalled during the 1960s that the subway was still open, albeit rarely used, with lots of vandalism and the stench of urine in the air. Another poster said they went to the school during the 1970s, and by then the subway had been closed down and gated off. Another poster even mentioned gaining access to the old underground tunnel around the time the yellow light rail line was being built in the early 2000s, and compared the experience to entering a pharaoh's tomb. So there were big plans. This was kind of one of the early editions of using a tunnel, go underground, help protect the kids. And they wanted to build a lot more. And I found no evidence that actually happened. I found references to other schools wanting to put in similar subways, but with no follow-up. Meaning, we don't know if they ever did, and if they ever did, maybe they didn't last very long. And I think very much that the fact that
didn't even take 2 years of that one at Interstate in Ainsworth to kind of get dirty, start being a place for creepers to hang out. Parents are angry, the school board's angry. Even it gets to a point, ooh, what's happening to my face? It even gets to a point where the police are getting kind of angry and fed up about the whole thing. And as much as other schools saw that probably in the mid to late 1920s as this kind of revolutionary way to protect children, because that didn't really start becoming a thing, subways like that around here till then. I think when they started seeing the negative sides of having that, and the fact that the school board alone, it wasn't just people whose kids went to this school, it wasn't just people who worked at this school, it was the school board as a whole were frustrated about what was going on there, how dirty it was, how dangerous it potentially was to children. This was primarily there for kids. This wasn't, I mean, an adult could use it if they needed to, but it was there for the kids. And there's degenerates hanging out down in there. So I think that was kind of a bit of a red flag to other schools and the school board that, you know, it seemed like a good idea on paper, but I think a lot of schools realized there were a lot of negatives to go with this, and some potentially very bad things might have happened had they built a whole bunch of these all over town.
Between 1926 and 1927, the largest underground subway systems the city of Portland would ever see were erected. Comparable in structure, one was erected at 2nd and Burnside, in the heart of the city's Skid Row. The other would be erected on the east side of the river at the intersection of Broadway and Larrabee, albeit for a while Larrabee was also part of Interstate. In both instances, entrances to the subway tunnels were erected at multiple sites at those intersections. In particular, the Broadway-Larrabee site, where an entrance was at all 4 corners of the intersection. Both locations included thin safety islands near the intersections that pedestrians could access through the tunnels, allowing them to safely board on passing streetcars. That was the critical connection between these two locations. They both existed just beyond the approach to major bridges, the Burnside and the Broadway. In fact, in both of these cases, there were much less spoken of subways that existed on the opposite sides of these bridges. Barely ever mentioned in print, there was a subway near 3rd and Burnside on the east side of the river, and a subway down off of the Broadway Bridge that allowed for access in the direction of nearby Union Station on the west side of the river. Now, there was enough resources that noted there was another subway on the east side of Burnside, east side of the bridge here. There wasn't a lot of information about it, but there was enough that, like, I know it was here. I don't know how long it was here, the exact, year of construction, year of closure, and I couldn't really find any evidence of it on old pictures, but east side, 3rd and Burnside, there was one of these subways at one time that probably just got you down there as the bridge went so far. It may have also been a part of the, it probably would have had to be a part of the bridge construction. So this is 2nd we're crossing over, 3rd it's just on the other side here. So yeah, we're still elevated above that. So it makes sense that the subway on this side would have also been a part of the bridge project, because the bridge doesn't fully come down to ground level till Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, or former Union Avenue. So there had to be one right over here. Now, I mean, there probably was one on both sides. There actually is. I think that's a stairwell right over there that does go down. Maybe it is. So it's kind of in place of where the subway would have been, because there would have been a subway
leading down to, this is 3rd. So there would have been a subway in these parts. Where exactly towards this end? I mean, I'm guessing there was at least one on this side and then one right over there, but I can't say for certain. I dug around in pictures and I couldn't really find anything.
These two primary subway locations also came as the result of major construction projects. The Broadway and Larrabee site came as a result of a widening of that intersection in relation to work being done on the east side approach to the Broadway Bridge. And the 2nd and Burnside site was erected in direct connection to the construction of the 1926 Burnside Bridge. The Broadway and Larrabee site, arguably the most problematic of all, was approved as part of a larger overall plan in February 1927, and it's one of the few where part of the system still exists. When I heard stories that a small iron covering at the northeast corner of Broadway and Larrabee was an old entrance to the tunnels below, I said, no way, seeing how small that iron cover was. But when I went to that site, I was, I guess you could say, pleasantly surprised at what I discovered for myself.
I mean, they say this is that. This looks so small. Like, how did anybody go downstairs? Oh my God, I actually think there are stairs down there. Just have to like get it angled in there, but let's get there. Wait, where's the? Okay, the light is. Okay, so. Oh my God, there are stairs down there. And it's interesting, there's still islands here that are they're in close proximity to where the other ones were. We almost have like markers showing where the old ones were, where you go to get on the subway.
The first work on this subway project, the excavation work that saw the whole area around the intersection look like it had been ripped apart by a tornado, at least according to the description of it at the time, started in October 1927. With iron steps down into a system of 6-foot wide tunnels leading across the streets into the streetcar, lighted and airy, this subway opened to the public on December 20th, 1927. Met with great pride and excitement with regards to a modern American city moving forward with a new style of crossing busy streets, these expensive efforts wouldn't make it a year before the winds of general citywide support began to change. On July 31st, 1928, an aging and respected local fire captain, Gus Steffen, who'd been with the fire department since the 1880s, was grabbed, struck with a blunt instrument, and robbed of his pay as he was in the process of walking home after cashing a paycheck from work. This all happened down in the tunnels below Broadway and Larrabee. While stories such as this were not as common as they would become over time, this attack did not help with the general perception locals had of these new subways. Sure, they were cool and new, but they were tunnels descending into an unknown darkness. It turned out most people were not fans of taking their chances with these tunnels, and they continued to take a potentially greater risk by dodging busy traffic on the streets. 1929 would be the most controversial year in the history of these subways. In May of this year, the city's traffic division did an investigation into the matter by monitoring traffic at 2nd and Burnside on a Saturday morning. By their count, only 262 out of 1,697 pedestrians, or about 15% of them, used the subway to cross. The numbers they found were not much different at Broadway and Larrabee. In fact, of all the known subways at that time, only the lesser-used East Side, 3rd, and Burnside subway saw more people using it than crossing the street itself. So, considerable money had been spent to build something with the objective of getting pedestrians through an intersection safely while helping vehicular traffic by keeping pedestrians from crossing at street level, and yet most people were still taking the risk, crossing the street and making the effects of opening up traffic to vehicles minimal at best. One editorial from April 1929 directly called these subways a disgrace to the city and a menace to the people that use them. The reasons given as to why so many people avoided these subways were many. One reason was that the tunnels down below were often used as a loitering place for what was called an undesirable class of people. By this time, many people had been accosted or flat out attacked and robbed. It made sense, as if someone was traveling along and no one else was in those tunnels, they were a convenient target. Local newspapers were peppered over the years with stories of people being attacked in those tunnels beneath the city. They were also called out for being a gathering place for local drunks and transients. Discarded dirty clothes were often scattered about in there, while empty cans of denatured alcohol were also a frequent sighting. This type of alcohol could be cheaply obtained and was frequently used by the homeless men of the Skid Row area. In 1934, a mislabeled can believed to contain denatured alcohol sold in bottles at a Skid Row pharmacy would lead to the death of almost 30 people. It made a lot of sense that such containers would be found at a place like Broadway and Larrabee, and even more so at 2nd and Burnside. Another investigative group looked into the drama of these tunnels and found them to be dark, dingy, and unwelcoming. In accordance with the chaotic graffiti of today, this group also noted the walls of these subways had been vandalized with profanity accompanied by, quote, suggestive drawings. And finally, in particular at Broadway and Larrabee, there were so many entrances and exits that some people got legitimately lost down there and would need to ask others where they were supposed to go. It was described by some as a labyrinth. In particular, women avoided these tunnels at all costs, primarily because of the types of characters to possibly be found in them. But there was another key factor that affected the decisions of women specifically, and that was how the stairs down into the subways were built. The steps were narrow with an iron pattern, and this was the late 1920s, a time when most women's footwear consisted of having thin heels, perfect for getting stuck in openings in these iron steps. The city's response to this? Well, we're not going to adjust the way we do things to accommodate with women's footwear. And furthermore, when it rained, being metal, these steps became very slick while the rainwater would pool up in those tunnels below. The stories of women being injured going down these stairs were ample. Stories of broken bones, women being led up on stretchers. By June of 1929, a motion to close down the subways at 2nd and Burnside and Broadway and Larrabee was passed by a committee put together by then Mayor George Baker. It seemed then like these almost brand new subways were not long for this world. During the work of this committee, one proprietor at Broadway and Larrabee stated that he had called for an ambulance some 20 different times specifically for women who had fallen down the subway stairs and injured themselves. In less than 2 weeks after the motion by the committee was passed, a Mrs. M.B. Barleen was attacked in the subway at Broadway and Larrabee by a young man, struck over the head with a pipe. But she managed to get free, screamed for help, and scared her attacker away. After her escape, Barleen said flat out, "I'll never go through one of those subways again." Over time, this would be the greatest deterrent to pedestrians using these subways, the endless stories involving attacks on others down in these tunnels below. While often this was the work of petty criminals seizing an opportunity, the fear of locals ballooned to concerns that the likes of career criminals and jail escapees were hiding down there, desperate and dangerous. It was also noted that, in already being underground, being in locations with so much loud traffic above, it made it easier for attackers as their actions were less likely to be heard. It became more and more apparent that the best way to keep things safe was having police officers stationed at these locations to keep the predators away. But this was often rejected by the city due to the cost it would have taken to do this. And yet they were investing in these little used and generally disliked subways, one of which cost between $10,000 and $15,000 to build. The police department itself sided with closing the subways down altogether as the potential negatives outweighed the marginal positives. Perhaps that had an effect, the amount of money already spent, but after the motion was passed to close down these subways, the city council suddenly dropped the matter, like a hot coal. These subways would continue to be used with little work done to fix them up. Nothing to see here, apparently. That said, there was pressure on the other side to keep these subways around, and the city even claimed their investigative work revealed that a loss of life was being prevented by the existence of these subways. And sure, nobody who actually took these subways had to worry about being hit by an automobile, but in stepping down into the darkness, there lingered fears of being hit by something else. It was a complicated situation with negatives on both sides. On one side, nobody really wanted to use these subways, even those who did, but by closing or removing them, it opened up a situation wherein more pedestrians would inevitably be put in danger. And as far as the question of why didn't they just put crosswalks in? Well, pedestrian crossings, as they were originally called, did not even become frequent until the 1930s, with the first actual sidewalk, as we know them, not happening until 1951. You ever look back at those old videos of busy streets and there's always a bunch of people just wandering in the streets, haphazard between the vehicles? No crosswalks, limited signals. It was the Wild West out there. That said, signal lights were a thing by the 1920s. In fact, they were often suggested as replacements for these subways. But even that seldom happened, at least not till later on. I really think the city was hung up on the tens of thousands of dollars invested in building these things, and in a diluted way wanted to get their money's worth. The subway established at 2nd and Burnside, as mentioned before, was erected as part of the construction of the 1926 Burnside Bridge. While Broadway in Larrabee was not far away, just across the river and a little north, this subway setup was built at the epicenter of Skid Row. Lots of unemployed men hanging around, North End criminals, transients, alcoholics, stick-up men, highwaymen, the works. Women seldom used this subway as well, for all the reasons previously mentioned, but furthermore, the entrances here specifically were always lined with men who would harass and follow them around. When considerations were being made to close these subways, even Mayor Baker himself visited the tunnels below 2nd and Burnside and called them unsatisfactory. And yet, again, these subways were never closed. While these subways served to get people across busy streets, again, a key element of them was providing access to streetcars, even at a time where, granted, no one could know for sure at the time, but streetcar use was in the early stages of decline. The safety islands, located in the middle of the street where people awaited coming streetcars, would ultimately come under fire because so many people were crashing their own cars into them. I've said it in the past, if you haven't seen how people drove back in the old days, they were kind of out of control. On September 12, 1934, the push increased when a car accident at one of these islands took the lives of 2 people. Like with the subways themselves a few years earlier, the city found itself facing pressure to get rid of these islands. But they had a way out. The subway system was built at 2nd and Burnside as part of the original bridge project, which technically extended to 3rd and Burnside. And being over the river, the bridge and that which was associated with it was under the control of Multnomah County and not the city of Portland. So the city just dumped the safety island drama on the county. And still, nothing was really done. And with little work done, and the crimes continuing, the dwindled usage of these subways continued to be less and less over time. The 2nd and Burnside one would be closed down and boarded up at the start of 1936 due to their condition. This came after ongoing complaints from local business owners as to the types of people it attracted to the area. But then, they were opened again, and closed again. They would remain closed between 1940 and 1953 when, after some renovation work, the tunnels at 2nd and Burnside were opened up again. But they were opened with restricted hours, 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. This subway would remain for several more years at this location, closing down prior to 1980. Of the worst crimes to happen in these subways, after the 30s, there was a string of what were called subway sluggings at Broadway and Larrabee. This led to the stationing of officers on location, as the attacker in the case seemed to be doing it just for the violence, as they'd made no effort to rob their victims. These attacks came a few years after massive renovation work was done at the Broadway and Larrabee site in 1938, which included better lighting as well as officers patrolling close by. But in particular, they cut back corners in the tunnels to remove places for potential attackers to hide. And yet the attackers were not deterred. Perhaps the greatest string of violence to ever happen in one of these subway systems occurred at Broadway and Larrabee in 1965. Several individuals during the spring and summer of that year, mostly elderly men, were attacked and robbed by 2 younger men. These 2 became known as the subway robbers. I found no information stating that these men were ever apprehended for their crimes. The subway had really overstayed its welcome, and by this time it was abundantly clear that putting in crosswalks and new traffic signals were a more effective route to take in terms of getting people across busy streets. In October 1966, the Commissioner of Public Works for the city, William Bowes, called this subway a problem for the city since it was built. He represented a consensus at the time, and the decision was made to finally close the Broadway-Larrabee subway permanently. While it would be delayed, this subway would finally be closed in April 1968. At that time, sidewalks and a new traffic signal were put in place. Despite all of the problems created by these two early efforts in helping people cross the street, others came afterward. There was a very narrow, crypt-like pedestrian subway only a block away from the one at Broadway and Larrabee, in existence prior to an Interstate Avenue extension project that happened in 1950, drastically changing the area on the east side of the Willamette River between the Steel and Broadway bridges. Before this project, the closest street to the river through here was Crosby Avenue, which ran close to in line with where Interstate goes through today. A stairway still exists on the south end of the east side approach to the Broadway Bridge that lines up perfectly with what once went down below Crosby.
Now I'm sure there were probably multiple of these subways that I'm not covering that did exist. Some maybe just didn't get talked about much, were built at times they weren't being talked about a lot, or just weren't around for very long, because the Cosby, I guess you could call it like the Cosby Street underpass that came off of the Broadway Bridge up here, I didn't even know that existed until I found one article on it. And that was the only newspaper article in particular I found on it. The only piece of information I found that this thing even existed. I think part of that was that it wasn't open that long. But I mean, there's one instance where there was one that absolutely existed right up over here, and there was barely any documentation about it. Something that would have been incredibly easy to miss even if you were looking hard. So in the one clear image I have of this, you can see that Crosby Avenue, I think I've called it Crosby Street maybe once or twice. It is up, when it intersects with Broadway crossing to the bridge here, it's like on a ramp leading up to it. So Crosby would have been climbing up to that level. And that means that the Crosby, I guess you can call it the Crosby Avenue subway, would have been going under right here where Interstate is today. So we're able to look right at the area where the tunnel was, because we're under where Crosby Avenue was. And the stairwell leading down to it, the last surviving relic. So, I mean, there had to be some reason, or at least some motivation, because Broadway and Larrabee is like just over a block that way, and they had subways over here. And so right down here, they had a subway where I guess people who cross the bridge primarily would get off, they would come down these stairs, and there would be a tunnel awaiting them. Like right through here. And they'd get to the other side of Crosby, and I guess maybe it's just the other one was so close. Like, this doesn't really benefit, you know, people are going like this direction, which is the only logical reason to even go down here to cross under on the south side of Broadway would be to get over in this area, and you've got Broadway and Larrabee right over there allowing you the same thing. So I really don't know why this was built. But this actually makes a lot of sense, and you can see the railing is the same as a lot of those that were built in the 40s, even the railing up here. I know by 1948 it had been closed for years, but it may have not been open that long. Because you look at this, and you look at it from a modern perspective, and you think this was put in here before this big change happened, and Crosby Avenue was removed, and then Interstate was put in going this way. And you look at this and you think, why is this here? This doesn't make any sense to be here. Like, technically it leads you down like to a sidewalk, but like it doesn't seem really special. Looking out for needles, my favorite game. Yeah, literally. There's Broadway and Larrabee right there. We're right next to it. So perfectly, the tunnel, if it was in line, would have come through here. So the stairs probably would have started somewhere around here and climbed up, and probably, right about this area that I'm looking at here is probably where you'd come out if it was just your general stairwell. I should probably check some more overhead images of this area. Hopefully there's some pre-1950. You might see another exit somewhere in the vicinity of the bridge right here.
This railing here matches perfectly with the railing of the still existing 1948 Kelly Avenue subway, as well as another one I will be discussing that was opened in 1942. We can see then the shift in how these entrances were being done by the 1940s, as those earlier ones from the 20s had concrete walls around the stairwells. And remember what I said earlier about people being concerned that high-end criminals and jail escapees would seek asylum in these tunnels? Well, that managed to rear its ugly head again in December of 1948, a few years after this particular subway under Crosby had been closed and boarded up. At this time, a teenage escapee from the Woodburn School for Boys was apprehended for armed robbery, and when asked where he'd been staying, he said he'd been hiding in a shelter under the east end of the Broadway Bridge. When officers checked the site, they found the boarding over the entrance had been broken and numerous discarded items had been left in there, including a pile of straw likely used as a makeshift bed. It was felt this site had likely been used by criminals for years, granted with no specific evidence to back that claim. And one might say, well, if this stairwell was still there, how did nobody notice for years that this subway had been opened back up? But we must understand that it really didn't make any sense for the average citizen to use this stairwell, as it presumably just went down to a boarded-up wall going nowhere. And in less than 2 years after this discovery, this site would be destroyed forever, as Interstate was run through here. I mentioned recently a subway that was opened in 1942. Well, this subway just happens to connect back to a story I recently covered, the Front Avenue Widening Project, or rather, the project that led to the construction of Harbor Drive along the downtown waterfront. This meant changes on the waterfront and, in particular, under the Morrison Bridge. At this time, the second Morrison Bridge, opened in 1905, was standing and accessed Morrison Street. With the current bridge built next to it in the late 50s, this is why the modern Morrison Bridge does not actually merge into Morrison Street. But for our sake, as part of this project's work, a pedestrian subway was slated to run down a stairwell from the south side of the bridge's west end. This went down to ground level, leading pedestrians down into the subway itself at the present-day southwest corner of Nato and Morrison. This subway then passed under Nato, or Front Avenue at the time, to the strip of land that existed between Front Avenue and Harbor Drive. The key motives for this was to provide pedestrians easier access to these strips of presumably parkland between Front and Harbor, but also the former Portland Public Market building, which would later become the site of the Oregon Journal newspaper. So, serious question. So I'm about to cross under the on-ramp to the Hawthorne Bridge. Is this a pedestrian subway? It's not, but I'm using it to get from here to there, okay? I feel like this is my children's, like when you're doing children's programming portion. Here's a pedestrian subway. Here's a pedestrian subway. Is this a pedestrian subway? Which one doesn't belong? Northrop Blossom and Fitch building. The original building's just this part. Second oldest commercial structure in the city. Pass by a lot of history on your way to where you're trying to get to. Here's Morrison crossing Nato Parkway, and the entrance to the subway going under the former Front Avenue was right at this intersection. Back from, like, this little piece is sticking out, so it would have been, and it was really close to the edge of the street, so it would have been right here. So the modern day Morrison Bridge right over there, built beside of the previous one, which actually went into Morrison Street, as you think would make sense. So the old bridge came through here, came down, and so the stairwell that led down from the original, or from the previous bridge, it would have been like just right up here somewhere as the bridge crossed over, and it didn't actually come to ground level till further down there. So you had to come down this stairwell to this location right here, and there was an entrance to the subway that took you under Front Avenue and to the other side. And it's all waterfront park here today, but the Portland Public Market and later Oregon Journal building was right over here. So it was a real quick and easy way to get to that location as well. You went down the stairwell and it was very close to the edge of the street, so the tunnel itself was probably in this, it was a pretty wide tunnel compared to others. If you see pictures of it, like, people could walk past each other and still be like 10 feet apart. So it was probably somewhere here, came out on the other side. Now I'm on the other side. So again, if the entryway was right over there, we would have come down here, gone under probably right about here. You know, from like there to here. So it would have come out somewhere in this area. And it's been gone for so many years, and there's so much work that's been done through here. There's no signs of it anymore. Yeah, I mean, why would there be? And a subway in this area made sense. beyond the fact that the waterfront had become considerably less pedestrian-friendly. But if you look at pictures of the area, even into the 1960s, one thing you'll see Front and Harbor sorely lacking was crosswalks. While I found one source that said this subway was closed down in 1969, there was a pedestrian tunnel that went under Front Avenue from Morrison Street up until the spring of 1990, when it was closed down due to the reasons one might presume at this point. The clearest image I could find of this particular subway, or rather its entrance, was from a 1958 aerial image where the entrance on the west side of Front can be seen. In these later years, after the Oregon Journal building was demolished and the Tom McCall Waterfront Park was constructed over the grave of the demolished Harbor Drive, the underground tunnel served a new purpose in allowing people to get to and from the park. But by 1980, not long after Waterfront Park was finished, the tunnel was described as something locals tried to avoid. And even by the end of the 80s, shortly before being closed, being cleaned daily was not enough, and the entryways were capped off and eventually covered. This description of how it was closed down suggests the tunnel was not filled in, and thus it may still serve as an open space down there under the Nadeau Parkway at Morrison Street. Things like this, where they were once common but nowadays not so much, tend to have an eventual story of decline to back it. But in the case of Portland, one could argue the pedestrian subway started to decline almost as quickly as they became a reality. They never really had a boom period. Honestly, the only ones that got frequent use in terms of a higher percentage of people using them over dodging traffic in the street were probably the ones near schools. Little kids would be much less likely to willingly dodge traffic over an adult. Even by the end of the 1920s, most business owners near one, as well as the police department, were behind getting rid of them altogether. This one is not a long and illustrious history. Something I seldom mentioned directly, which was a burden on subways like these all across the country, was the added cost of maintenance works to keep these places functional. Based on the frequent outcry from locals as to the horrid conditions of these subways, it seems maintaining them was not extraordinarily high on Portland's to-do list. And while tunnels have always had a use in terms of trains and automobiles, with the passage of time, beyond the high expense of building them, subways started being seen as having a detrimental cause. Having to go underground was a depressing prospect in and of itself, but to do so in the middle of the city took people away from street-level businesses. With time, crosswalks and traffic signals were cheaper and easier to maintain. And you had a much greater chance of getting from one side of the street to the other without someone jumping at you in the secluded darkness down below. All of the subways that no longer exist in Portland went away because they were too dangerous, too much trouble to maintain, had a limited purpose, and or had become better known as places to loiter rather than to pass through. And while some are closed, and others make you want to look over your shoulder before entering, independent of their contemporary status, these pieces that still remain from Portland's history of pedestrian subways are still a charming piece to any city's history, even if that charm is of the diamond in the rough variety.